That's what threw me off.
You could have been a guess and
Remember, it is fine.
I don't know about that.
I was there.
I'm like,
I wasn't even called her.
I was thinking 1928, 1930.
All right, let's get rolling, everybody. Let us get rolling. Want to announce this. I have one more opportunity to announce this. Make sure you're here on Sunday. We're going to have a good time. Going to hear a lot of ministry reports, financial reports, hand out some awards, food trucks afterwards. It's going to be a great Sunday. One worship time, 10:30. Don't come at 10. You won't be able to come in. So come at 10:30. We'll all worship together. Fort McKinley campus is going to be coming up. We're going to be bringing some vans up to bring our family from there up. And so we'll see you at 10:30 on Sunday. And then also, if you want to get the book, there's the book. Perfect. Let's recap like we do every week. Somebody give me the 3 P's to understanding the culture of the Bible. Not everybody at once. Somebody give it to me. Patriarchy. Patriarchal. Patrilocal. Patrilineal. There it is. There are the 3. What are the 5 individuals?
Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David.
Yes, Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David. What are the 3 regions? Somebody else. Mesopotamia, Canaan, and Egypt. Excellent. Fictive kinship, what is it? Like adoption. I like that. That's everyone's go-to answer now. Just adoption. Just adoption. Yes. Kinship ties where there is no blood nor marriage connection. 2 types of treaties or covenants.
Parity and suzerain vassal.
Parity and suzerain vassal. Excellent. 3 main elements in God's original plan. People, place, and presence. Yes, the people of God and the place of God, dwelling in the presence of God. What imagery did we discuss that was present in the Garden of Eden? Cherubim. Trees. River. Good. Which one is not present in the New Jerusalem? Cherubim. Perfect. What is God's final intent? The 3 P's again. Yes, the people, the place, and the presence of God. Last week, what did God show dominance over in the story of the flood?
Jordan River and the Red Sea.
The sea, yeah, just generally the sea, which they feared, right? That's the same answer. What did Abram's name change signify?
new prairie.
A new character and then
Yeah, do you remember what it went from and to? Abram to Abraham, but what did the meanings change? How did the
father of a people first for Abram, and father of a nation. No, father of a
You're real close there. It was.
And father of.
You're very close. You're right there. You're right there. Exalted father to father of multitude. Exalted father to father of multitude. So we are to this week. Okay, so we've already discussed who are the 3 that we've discussed already? Adam, Noah, Abraham or Abram. So we're going to get to the 4th one, which is whom? Moses. Good. Now, as we talked all the way back, I think in week 1, we said that we need to make sure that we but look at their real time and their real place. Like these are real people, real places, in real time, and so we need to examine and know what time they lived in and where they lived for that to make sense. So when we're talking about Moses' real time, the time that he existed is, as Run DMC said, tricky. Okay, it's tricky. Anyone in Run DMC fans? No, you? One of us? Good. Yeah, no, don't be ashamed of that. Don't be ashamed of that. There are others in this room, they're just not wanting to say it. Okay? But it is tricky to rock a rhyme, and it is also tricky to figure out Moses' real time. Timing in the Bible is tricky in the Bible because times don't always mean what we think they mean. So there are two ways that we can actually go about deciphering Moses' real time. Okay, so the first way is by going strictly with biblical evidence. So just using what the Bible says to figure out when Moses existed and when Moses lived and when the story of his life took place. If we do that, it should fall in the middle of the 2nd century BC. This is called the early date. The early date. In 1 Kings 6:1. I should have put bookmarks in. 1 Kings 6:1 says, in the 480th year after the Israelites left Egypt. 480th year when the Israelites left Egypt. So according to the biblical evidence, Solomon begins to build the temple in the 4th year of his reign, which would be 480 years after the Exodus. And so when we compare the royal chronologies that we see in the divided kingdom, there's the divided kingdom that we see in the Old Testament, with what has been found in Mesopotamia, that works out to be around 1447 BC-ish, okay? About the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. That would place, the Exodus would be around 1447 BC. The other things took place around 966 BC, due the 480 years. So this is considered to be the early date based strictly on the biblical evidence. Okay? There's another way to measure the time, and this is an alternative method, and that works out to be about 1290 BC. This is called the late date, because they're really creative in naming things. So this is later, so they call it the late date. Now, it is not derived from a specific Bible chronology. Okay, remember we talked about that Bible chronologies can be problematic because times and genealogies and things like that weren't always there to communicate strictly time. Okay, so this is not based on a specific Bible chronology, but most scholars suggest that lean towards this explanation or lean towards this date for a couple of reasons. One, archaeology and inscriptions support an early 13th century date. So other archaeological evidence, other inscriptions, other writings suggest this date. The other reason why they think this is a better date is the number in Solomon's account in that 1 Kings passage is a little too tidy. That number 480 is just a little too neat. It's a nice round number. It's like too perfect of a number. It's not 483 years. It's not 476. It's 480. It's a little too perfect. So that number 480, scholars believe, could have been used to communicate something else, specifically as a way of communicating the span of time between God's deliverance in the Exodus and God's formalization of his presence with his people in the temple. How did they get to that number? 12 is a popular number in the Bible, popular number to the Israelites. Why is that a popular number with the Israelites?
There were 12 sons.
Yeah, 12, which turned into 12 tribes of Israel. Yeah, the 12 sons turned into the 12 tribes. And then 40 would have been considered a standard number for the length of a generation. So put those two together, multiply them together. The 480 could have been used as a way to communicate the completion of generations. This communication of this perfect period of time between one event and another event. Okay, so that's another reason why scholars say it's a little too perfect. Plus, if you really dig into the chronologies provided between Exodus and that 1 Kings passage, you get more than 480 years. Okay, so again, people can look at that and go, see, the Bible has contradictions, right? So we can't believe the Bible. But that's looking at it through our lens, our culture, that this is how time is measured and this is how time is communicated. But in their culture and their time, it meant something different and communicated something different. So this tells us one of two things. The Bible's chronology is terribly inconsistent, or The biblical authors, again, were trying to communicate something specific with those numbers. So either way, just a reminder, it's tricky. Okay, the timing is tricky. That's the last time they're going to show up tonight, I think. So again, they don't necessarily communicate what we think it communicates. So hold on to dates that you see in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament. Hold on to those loosely, okay? And never stake the authority of the Bible on what dates you might see in the Bible. So that's Moses' real time, probably 1290 BC. So let's look at Moses' real space. Moses' real space. His real space, we have to rewind to get to his real space. And it starts with Joseph. We know Joseph, Technicolor Dreamcoat, sold by his brothers into slavery. Do you remember where he was sold into slavery? Not quite. It was on the way to. It was a caravan traveling to Egypt. The town called, what's that?
Syria?
No. It was actually a town called Dothan. Town called Dothan. And they were traveling again to Egypt. So extra biblical evidence communicates that there was a well-traveled highway and several other routes between what and what? What two superpowers? Mesopotamia and Egypt, right? Dothan would have been and was an important junction between these two superpowers. Okay, so there's a lot of traffic going to and from Dothan. And we also know from other records that these countries, in these countries, that slave trade was prominent between the two countries. Okay, this was something that we don't just see in the Bible, but we see it in other evidence as well. And we can, this is interesting, but we can fairly safely track the going rate for a slave between the years of 2000 and 400 BC. They have records that indicate how much a slave would have cost. And the going price in the 18th century was 20 silver shekels. Genesis 37:28 says that Joseph was sold for how much? Just say the same thing I just said. 20 silver shekels, right? 20 coins. So this idea of someone being sold into slavery in this area at this time, getting this, the people getting this amount of money for it can be confirmed with extra biblical references. So it's not just, oh, I read it in the Bible, and so it's true, and I just need to ignore other evidence. Well, the other evidence points and says, no, that's probably pretty accurate. Okay? And so we know that Joseph was sold as a domestic servant. He was imprisoned. He was released, and he was elevated to a key position in Egypt. So if we stick with the later date of the 1290 BC, this would fall within an area called the Hyksos era in Egypt. The Hyksos area. And during this era, the Semites were ruling in Egypt. Now, the Semites were not looked favorably upon by the indigenous Egyptians. They called them vile Asiatics, which sounds sort of like a Shakespearean cut down, right? Vile Asiatics. So Joseph's rise falling within this time of the period of the Hyksos makes it even more likely that this happened, okay? Other things that suggest this time period, this later time period, some of the traditions that happened to him at this time, that he was shaved, he had linen clothing put on him, he had a gold collar put around his neck, he was renamed with an Egyptian name, he was married to an Egyptian princess, are all details that would confirm him landing within this period, this Hyksos era in Egypt. Now, when we think about Egypt, when I think about Egypt, I don't want to assume that I know what you're thinking, but when I think about Egypt, I think of this. Is that anybody else? This is like the first image, maybe the Sphinx, that comes to my mind, but desert, right? Desert comes into my mind. I think sand, I think hot. That's what I think. Which makes it really weird that Joseph is, when he's made prime minister, his family goes where to get food? Egypt goes here to get food. Seems like a strange place to go get food, but not all of Egypt is a desert.
Yeah, the Nile River basin.
There you go, smarty pants. Yes, the Nile River basin makes it a very fertile region. The Nile River flooded every year, which brought water to the region. They developed means of irrigation, but it would also litter the fields of Egypt with all sorts of decomposing stuff like fish and seafood, maybe seafood, I meant seaweed, but seafood probably also. Fish is seafood. Fish poop, like all this stuff would be really good fertilization for the land. So as a result, Egypt was never in short supply of food or of grain. That's why Joseph's family went there. So Joseph's family goes there. They have the whole, revealing of who Joseph is. After he reveals himself to his family, Jacob, the other sons, all the other relatives, they settle in the eastern Nile Delta, also known as Goshen. And we read that the reason that they settled there was because all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians, which seems sort of random, right? Seems like an odd reason, but we know from other extra-biblical sources that other Semitic groups had settled in this region. So it makes sense that they would have settled there as well. And we see this happening throughout the Middle Bronze Age. Egyptian literature, again, calls this influx, discusses this influx of the vile Asiatics, with the reasons being their need for food and water, just like Joseph's family. So in the Egyptian literature, we see, we had all these Semitics show up because they needed food and water. In our Bible, we read Joseph's family came to Egypt to get what? Food and water, right. So Joseph settles his family in this region already populated by other Semitic groups. Eventually, at the end of Genesis, what happens at the end of Genesis? To Joseph, what?
He dies.
He dies, yeah. Joseph dies, okay? And we turn the page on the book of Genesis. And we turn the page on the book of Genesis and we get to what? Exodus. We get to Exodus, but not just the book, also the event of the Exodus. Before we get to that, how many are you? We just did a quiz on movies. Are you movie fans? Anyone? Are you fans of watching movies? Just Krista. Okay, good. You're allowed to raise your hands. Good. Thank you. There we go. Movie fans. Oh, I think one of the most underrated aspects of a movie is the musical score. You don't pay attention to it, but it can change everything about the movie. You hear scary music, you're like, oh dang, right? Like the little piano, was it Halloween or Friday the 13th? Yeah, or you hear ominous music playing, you're like, oh, something's about to go down, right? Or you hear happy music playing, you're like, oh, this is a good and happy. It can completely change the tone of the movie. And if you change the movie, you can change everything. You can change the music, like in this trailer for Elf, recut as a horror movie. We're gonna have to start this over so I get the volume up right. Hold on a second. Thought I had it working. One of these
Put
days.
her favorite movie on.
Thanks, Susan.
It's working out, Fitz.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah.
Mr. Hobbs? Yeah, I think someone sent you a Christmas gram.
Excuse me. I'm here to see a Walter Hobbs? I walked all day and night to find you.
You look like you came from the North Pole.
Exactly where I came from.
It's a little complicated, but it's nothing that we can't handle. What?
He thinks he's an elf.
I'm sorry, what?
Doctor, but you didn't know I was. Hey, guess what? I love you. I love you. I love you.
Get the hell out of here. What do you want, some money?
No. I just wanted to meet you. I thought you might want to meet me.
You saw that guy the other day. He's certifiably insane.
Looks like a Christmas tree.
He's probably just reverting to a state of childlike dependence.
We can't leave him alone.
What he needs is to be nurtured.
They were just having a little fun.
Fun. So felonies are fun.
Introduce him to Emily, Michael.
Go away!
Once he comes to terms with reality, he should drop the whole elf thing and move on with his life.
I can't go to sleep unless I get tucked in. Right, let's get it over with.
I'm Buddy the Elf.
So one of our communications team is a huge Elf fan, and I showed that to her today. She watches it like year round, and I think she's probably never watching it again. I think I completely ruined it for her, but the music can affect everything. Now the Bible does not have background music, unfortunately, which would be fun, but there is a line at the beginning of Exodus that completely changes the mood and completely changes the tone. So Genesis ends on kind of a high note, save the death of Joseph. It ends on kind of a high note. The family is back together. God's with his people again through the covenant, and the promise continues. And then we get to verse 8 of chapter 1 of Exodus, and we read, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph." And so everything here, it signifies that it shows us that the tide is turning. Like Joseph was elevated, he was respected, he was the second in Egypt. Family all got back together and moved to Egypt to be with him. And now we have a new Pharaoh, doesn't know Joseph. Things are about to change. So this Pharaoh doesn't know Joseph, doesn't know his family, doesn't know his lineage, and he starts to fear the rising number of the Semites. So he does what to them? He enslaves them, right, for his building projects. The numbers continue to rise, so the Pharaoh enacts a new law. What is that new law? It's a really bad one. Kills all the male Hebrew babies, right? That still doesn't work. So he takes it one step further and says that all male children should be thrown into the Nile River. Okay, super swell guy. Just imagine being in this place in the hearts and minds of these Hebrews, right? We think our world is bad, and it is in ways, but then we hear that and we're like, man, we're doing okay. Life is pretty good. Imagine the fear if you found yourself to be pregnant or nursing a child, wondering if they're going to find you out, and how terrible it's going to be when they come, snatch your baby away, and throw it into the river. We used to live right on the Mississippi River in Missouri, and a friend came and visited, and he and his 5-year-old son, who is on the spectrum, they went and took a walk down to the river. Little 5-year-old jumped in the Mississippi River. Fortunately, his dad is a strong swimmer, and he dove in and pulled him out, but they came back and they're like soaking wet. We're like, what the heck happened? And rivers are strong. and they're throwing all the babies, all the male babies, into the river. So these are not just stories that we read. These are real people at a real time, in a real place, exhibiting real faith. And there is external evidence, not for this specific event, but for events that it would fit within. So we already mentioned the Hyksos period, in which there was this huge influx of the Semites into Egypt. Well, they became so great in Lower Egypt that they built a capital city, they adopted Egyptian culture, and they ruled until the Egyptians drove them out. And after this happens, there's a shift, kind of like the shift we see at the beginning of Exodus. There's a shift in the foreign and domestic policy in Egypt, because they're determined not to let another foreign people group gain such power again. So we can see military action on their part, evidence of military action on their part, to make sure that they subjugate the region, and a dramatic increase in slave labor for their building projects. And this is from all extra biblical sources. So historical, archaeological writings, things like that, all point to the probability that this actually took place. There's not just a story in our Bible, okay? So into this atmosphere, this lovely atmosphere, we're introduced to a deliverer who is whom? Moses, okay? Moses, the deliverer. Now, Moses, your everyday Israelite could not have led the way that Moses led, because your everyday Israelite would have been illiterate. Your everyday Israelite wouldn't have had military training. They wouldn't have had any opportunity to organize anything with any sort of significance. But because of his unique upbringing, Moses was not an everyday Israelite. What was his unique upbringing?
He was a princess. The royal family.
Yeah, he was raised in the Egyptian royal household, right? So he was trained by the Egyptians. So he was trained to read, he was trained to write, he was trained to administrate and lead. He was able to interact with the Egyptians and trained in the arts of war and diplomacy. So the Egyptians, interestingly enough, unwittingly contributed to their own downfall. So just by this child being raised in one of their households, he grew up to basically take the Israelites out of Egypt. So they contributed to their own downfall. So you know how the story goes. Moses confronts Pharaoh, says, "Let my people go." Pharaoh says, "No." You got all the plagues. Which one is my favorite plague? Frogs. Frogs are my favorite, right? Eventually, God rescues Israelites by parting the Red Sea and allowing them to have plunder to take with them. So we see Israelite is rescued from a strong enemy against which she had no defense. The people are delivered from slavery, they're delivered from poverty, they're returned to a place of security, they're given an identity, they're given a future, they're given hope, they're given an inheritance. Does this sound like a concept we talked about in week 1? Which was what? Starts with an and ends with a deduction. Redemption, good, well done, right. Sounds a lot like redemption. And so, I'm sorry. This right here, the Exodus, is the defining moment in all of Israel's history. This is the one defining moment. Without this, there would be no Mosaic covenant, so there wouldn't be the law as we know it. There would be no Israel. But even more significantly, I think, God uses this event frequently to define himself. We read this at the very beginning of the Ten Commandments. "I am Yahweh your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." You see that elsewhere in Scripture. This is how God chooses to define himself. I'm the one who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of slavery. And this phrase also serves as, you may remember, the historical prologue part of the covenant, which was how the suzerain defined themselves and basically spelled out why the vassal should obey them and to enter into a treaty with them. So this is that. And it's also the precursor for the Ten Commandments. So from here on out, this is how Yahweh chooses to define himself, as the God who rescues slaves from their bondage and claims them as his own. So if we are to understand the faith of Israel, if we are to understand our own faith, if we are to understand our own salvation, we have to understand this. We have to understand the Exodus. Okay? Now, after the Exodus, after they leave slavery in Egypt, where's the next place they go? After wandering around for a while. Mount Sinai, thank you, yes. They go to Sinai, and so they wander around a bit. They find ourselves at Sinai. This is where the suzerain vassal treaty is offered by God to Israel, and upon their acceptance, they're changed from a bunch of tribes into one nation. They're now one nation. And so in Exodus chapters 19 through 32, we're going to read those in their entirety. We're not going to, just kidding. We see the building of this nation through a law, a calendar, and a religious system. A law, a calendar, and a religious system. First, the law creates and structures the nation by defining Yahweh's expectations. So that's what the law does, is it lays out the expectations that Yahweh has for Israel. The calendar, it organizes Israel's time. Less about January, February, March, and more like Sabbath, every seventh day or to what? Rest, not work, right? And then there are feasts that are at appointed times, and there are offerings that happen at particular times. And then I said the religious system, which is really summed up in the tabernacle. The tabernacle, because that enthrones the suzerain in their midst. Okay, so the kingdom of God is now instituted on earth. We see the people of God are dwelling with the presence of God, and they're on their way. They're not there yet, but they're on their way to the place of God. And so now with this structure, with this law and this calendar and the tabernacle, we see a theocracy at work. A theocracy is a nation ruled by God, as opposed to a democracy, which is a nation ruled by what? The people. And originally, it was ruled by the mob, which makes a lot of sense now. In theocracy, who is the king? Yahweh. Yahweh is the king. God is the king, which means that Israel's territory is whose territory? God's, right? Israel's enemies are whose enemies? God's, right? Israel's political interests were whose political interests? God's. Good. So within this structure, God places 3 human representatives to govern it. Anyone want to take a stab on what those 3 offices are?
Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Not exactly. No, but thank you. It's a good guess. 3 human offices. Jesus is described. Yes.
The priests.
Yes.
And the, well, that's one.
That's one. Good. We got priest.
Priest and king. Prophet,
King.
and prophet.
Prophet. Yes. Priest, prophet, and king. Here is what their jobs were. The priest speaks for the people to God. Remember, we talked about the high priest going into the Holy of Holies one day every year on the Day of Atonement to speak to God for the nation and to make atonement for the people to God. So the priest speaks for the people to God. The prophet goes the other direction. The prophet speaks for God to the people. When God has a word for the people, God speaks through the prophet. And then the king is the political leader, and one of their primary jobs is to keep the nation on track with regards to its covenant. So to make sure the people are living up to the agreement that they enacted with their suzerain. So priest, prophet, and king. Who's the most powerful?
Was that priest?
Jesus.
Jesus. Good Sunday school answer. He's alive. He hasn't really shown up on the scene physically yet. So we're going to go with prophet. The prophet was the most powerful. Because they spoke for whom? The king, which is God, right? He spoke for the king, Yahweh. A story that illustrates the power that the prophet had. David and Bathsheba. Know that whole story? If you don't, David's the king, most powerful person in the land. He's on a roof, sees Bathsheba taking a bath, says, "Bring that lady to me." He has an affair or uses his power to abuse her, whatever, however you want to define that particular encounter. It just wasn't good, either way. Ultimately, she gets pregnant. He tries to hide it, tries to get husband killed, ultimately does get her husband killed, takes him as her wife. Nathan comes along. Nathan is a prophet who speaks for whom? Speaks for God. He comes along and he goes up to David and he tells a little parable, tells a story about a man who's a very wealthy man, has lots of money, lots of animals, lots of everything. And there's another man who's a poor man who has one little sheep that he treats as his own child. He loves this sheep. The rich man is having a dinner party, wants to have some gyros, and so he needs some lamb meat. And so he goes and he takes the lamb from the poor man, has it slaughtered and killed, right? What was David's response?
He was very sad, unhappy that this happened. He didn't think it was right.
He wasn't unhappy, he was angry. He said he should be put to death. And Nathan said, "You're the man. You're the one who did this." He confronted the most powerful man that we would think, because he's the king, in the land, in front of all of his subjects, in front of his subordinates, in front of his court, right there in front of everybody. And he didn't go, "You're the man." He didn't run away fearing for his life. He didn't do that. He stood there confidently because he knew, and he knew David knew, who held the authority in that relationship. Because Nathan spoke for the true king, who was not David, but who was Yahweh, and David was subordinate to the true king and must obey the true king. So the prophet is the one who holds all the power in this particular setting. So let's go back to Moses. In the Mosaic covenant, in this treaty, we have the blueprint for the nation of Israel with these three individuals in offices to direct the nation. And within this covenant, we find that the promises to Abraham are now fulfilled. The promises of Abraham have now been fulfilled. What were the elements, the three elements of the promise given to Abraham? He was promised three things. Take a drink while you think.
He'd be the father of many nations.
So, lots of offspring. Good. What else would he be given? Land. One more. This one's a little more nebulous.
Money.
No.
Here.
Fame. Fame. I'm going to live forever. Fame. We see that Abraham, he's achieved fame. He's considered the father of the Jews. So that promise has been fulfilled. Offspring. We see that 2.5 million left Egypt. 2.5 million slaves left Egypt. That's a lot of offspring. It's a lot of kids, right? And we see that they are headed to Canaan. They go to Canaan, which is the promised land. So the promise that Abraham received has been fulfilled. The promise of people, place, and presence finds its first fulfillment here. And so in that sense, this event, the Mosaic covenant, serves as what's called a typological hinge. It typologically fulfills Abraham's covenant, and it foreshadows a new covenant typologically. I'm going to get into what that means here in just a minute, if you want to write that down. So typologically, it fulfills all three promises in the Abrahamic covenant, but it also foreshadows a new covenant typologically. Anyone need this up there any longer? 2 seconds. 1, 2. Brandon's still writing in his notebook, and I'm jealous. It's tricky. See, I see what you did there. Well done. Well played. You got it? Good, Brandon? You good? All right, sweet. So let's talk about a type. A type is an event or person in one era of redemptive history that has a specific parallel in another era. It's an event or a person in one era of redemptive history that has a specific parallel in another era. So it is not simply an allegory, it's not simply a symbol, but it is an actual historical event or a person, a specific parallel between two historical entities. Okay? So it's a person, event, and salvation history that helps us interpret later people or events. Anyone familiar with this movie, The Flight of the Phoenix? Yes? Good. I want to watch it now. I've read about it. I haven't watched it. I've watched a couple of clips of it. But in this movie, 1965 movie starring Jimmy Stewart, tells the story of, he's the pilot of a downed plane in the Sahara Desert. And there's a group of individuals which are stranded now in the desert, including a German engineer who nobody likes. Nobody likes this dude at all. Well, this hated engineer eventually reveals himself as an aeronautical engineer and suggests that they take the wreckage from the plane to build a plane so that they can fly for their rescue. And it sounds impossible, but they're like, we don't have a lot of options, so we should probably just go ahead and go for it. So they put everything behind this plan. They work hard, they ration all of their resources and so on, so that they can complete the plane, so they don't die. Now, the night before that they're about to fly, Jimmy Stewart's character asks the engineer, what kind of planes do you work on? And he says, model airplanes. And so everybody in the group is just like crushed. Like they've been placing all of their hope in this person and in this plan, and it's model airplanes. But the good news is that model airplanes work on the same principles and the same physics as regular full-size airplanes. The only difference is how much weight they can carry. That's the only difference between one and the other. And that's the essence of a type. It's real, it works, it happened, but it only has a potential for limited fulfillment. It can only go so far. So the Mosaic covenant was real. It was designed on the same principles as the new covenant, but it couldn't carry any weight. It couldn't carry the weight. The new covenant can carry as many souls from death to life and into eternity as it needs to, but the main function of this type is that it teaches. It teaches. It educates. So a couple of examples of the concept that we've talked about already. There's the first Adam, or Adam, and the second Adam. The first Adam we talked about when Jesus was tempted in the desert by the devil. It showed that Adam could have obeyed God in the garden, but he didn't. And Jesus showed that it is possible. So the first Adam was a type of the second Adam. Noah's Ark, it's a type of salvation of the new covenant. God in his mercy rescued a remnant from the evils of humanity and from the destruction and judgment that came as a result of that. That's a type of the salvation of the new covenant. And one we talked about last week, which was super fun, circumcision is a type of baptism. We talked about the fact that Abraham's children, the babies, were circumcised because before they could make a decision at all, they were born into this covenant, much the same way we baptize babies, because we believe that God's grace is at work in those children. So there's many examples of this in the Mosaic covenant. We're going to highlight one, which is the tabernacle. And we see this as one of the most important types that you see in the Old Testament. And so as you read through the New Testament, you'll see lots of talkbacks to the Old Testament, to the tabernacle, talking about the function or the staff or the furniture or the decorations or the floor plan and so on, as a way of explaining certain truths to their readers. So let's talk about the tabernacle as type. Why did God tell Moses to build the tabernacle?
They could have some kind of service.
Not exactly. They did worship there, but that wasn't the reason why he said build it. He wanted to dwell among his people. Exactly right. He said, so I may dwell among them. So God's people were in tents, so God was going to dwell in a what? Tent, right? And then when they became a sedentary people, they built a permanent structure for God, who becomes sedentary too. And we see in various scripture passage, God saying, I will dwell among them. So for the first time since Eden, the presence lives on earth. Now you might remember that there were different sections to the tabernacle. What are the three main sections of the tabernacle?
The Holy of Holies.
Holy of Holies, that's the innermost part, yes.
Holy.
Outer court and the holy place, right? So outer court is the big part, then the part under the tent is the holy place, and then inside you can't really see it because it's covered up with the bigger tent, would be the Holy of Holies. And so each place gets increasingly restricted because God himself sits on the throne in the Holy of Holies. So the increasing holiness of each area was communicated by the decreased size of each area. It goes from big to small to smaller yet. The quality and the value of the decor, you see, it's very sparse. There's not much decor in the outer court. As you get to the Holy of Holies, you get the covering over it, and there's some decoration. Then when you get to the Holy of Holies, did I just say Holy of Holies already? Holy place. And then to the Holy of Holies, it gets even more decorative, even more ornate in its decorations. And so God is... I just lost my place, right? Yeah, and also the number of people who could enter. So who could enter the outer court? Anybody? Who could enter the holy place? Priests. Who could enter the Holy of Holies? High priest, 1 day a year, Day of Atonement, worst job ever, right? Because if you were unholy, everybody knew it right away because you died. Which is just a terrible way to go out. So the increasing sanctification of each area and the rituals you had to go through to each communicated that God lives here in the Holy of Holies, and everyone who enters must be holy, or, which is a Hebrew word. So there's sort of an irony built into the tabernacle itself. It was built so, why again? So God could dwell among his people, his desire for cohabitation, to dwell among his people. But the elaborate structure and the separation of all the areas and the rituals communicates the separation from sin. So God is once again with Adam, but Adam is still separated from God. God's with Adam, but Adam is separated from God. So this type educated Israel about things like holiness and sin and mediation and sacrifice and forgiveness. This method of atonement was real. It worked. It was historical, but it was a model airplane. It just couldn't carry the weight. It provided what we call limited atonement. So then let's fast forward to the New Testament again, since this is a type of things to come. And here's how John describes Jesus. And the Word became flesh and dwelt, or tabernacled, among us. Israelites knew that the closest they would get would be the outer court. That was the closest they were going to get to God. And so Jesus is bringing the presence to them. We can't get to God, so God came to us. right? And then we see when Jesus is crucified, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, that the veil was torn in two. So the entrance to the Holy of Holies is thrown wide open, inviting anyone to enter. So the exiled children of Adam and Eve, remember they were kicked out of Eden, which was God's original intent and God's final intent, are now invited to touch and to see the presence of God once again. So then if we fast forward again to the book of Hebrews, the author, trying to explain the gospel to his Jewish audience, compares Jesus to the sacrifices in chapter 9 of Hebrews, compares him to the priesthood in chapters 4 and 5, and even the Old Testament structure of the tabernacle. And he frequently throughout that book talks about him being better than what has come before. Remember, the type is a model airplane, and the fulfillment is the full-size airplane. So Jesus is the high priest who enters the Holy of Holies for us and finally atones for our sin. He's also the sacrifice. He's also the veil which he himself tore in two. Here's what the writer of Hebrews writes. Brothers and sisters, we have confidence that we can enter the Holy of Holies by means of Jesus' blood through a new and living way that he opened up for us through the curtain, which is his body. And we have a great high priest over God's house. Therefore, let us draw near with genuine heart, with the certainty that our faith gives us, since our hearts are sprinkled clean from an evil conscience, and our bodies are washed with pure water. Let's hold on to the confession of our hope without wavering, because the one who made the promises is reliable. So again, Jesus is the full-size airplane because he can carry the weight that the model airplane of the Mosaic Covenant couldn't carry. And because the model plane, the tabernacle, all humanity has been educated in the mission to be the final sacrifice once and for all. And so we understand why the mission was necessary, so God might dwell with us. So then at the very end of the epic story, which is Revelation, it shouldn't surprise us to read this from John. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the what? Tabernacle of God is among men, and he will what? Dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them. So that's the type of the tabernacle. When we're talking about the Mosaic Covenant, we need to also talk about the law. We need to talk about the law. We've been talking about it on Sunday morning in worship for the past 10 weeks. What part does the law play? Is it good? Is it bad? Some people may interpret Paul's writings in some of his epistles to suggest that it was bad, that it was some kind of taskmaster as opposed to freedom that we find in the gospel. But Paul wrote this in Romans. He said the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. Doesn't sound like Paul is saying that the law is a bad thing. So then what role did it serve? What role did it serve? In its place in redemptive history, it basically sketched a profile of God to a fallen people about who God was and what he thought was good. It communicated who God was and what he thought was good. So before the law, the Israelites didn't know certain things about this particular God. And so through the law, they were able to learn that this God detested human sacrifice, self-mutilation, and temple prostitution. Through the law, they learned that this God was immune to magic and competed with no one. That this God was independent of the created order as opposed to the gods of other nations who were embedded in creation. That he didn't need humans to clothe or to feed him, or wasn't impressed or swayed with the construction of fancy temples. That he rejected the immolation or burning of children and would not speak through the entrails of slaughtered animals. So all of that stuff would have been normal for the other gods that were worshipped at the time. So the law was used to educate the Israelites about who this God was and what he thought was good and what he thought was bad. So this God, it communicated that this God is different, And as a result, his people should be different as well. And so that's what the law brought to Israel's world. It was a very good thing. Now, it is true, as we've been learning on Sunday mornings, that Jesus fine-tunes the law, right? He does this a lot in the Sermon on the Mount. He'll say, you've heard it said, do not murder, but I say blah, 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 whatnot, basically saying, do better than even that. And so each of those fine-tuning addresses commandments that not only have to do with motive and emotion and relationship, but also behavior. So it's not just about behavior, but motive, emotion, and relationship. We talked about that this Sunday with the do not covet. Like that's a motive, right? But then there's also outward behavior. So the Mosaic law addressed those elements too, but what the Old Testament law couldn't do was transform the motive, transform the emotion, transform the relationship. So as a result, the behavior didn't change either, because the inner person couldn't be changed through the Old Testament law. The author of Hebrews writes this: the law is a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the real things themselves. It can never perfect the ones who are trying to draw near to God through the same sacrifices that are offered continually every year. So Jesus, readdressing the law, was partly necessary to alert the Jews to the truth that their attempted obedience to the law wasn't working because their hearts weren't changing. Couldn't change the outward behavior if the inner man or the inner woman wasn't changing. Therefore, a new covenant was going to be necessary, a new relationship in which people could be transformed. How is that going to happen? By the seemingly impossible promise that the presence of God would not dwell in a tabernacle or in a temple, but would actually come to dwell inside of the individual, changing our hearts of stone into hearts of flesh, and writing God's law on our hearts. And this transformation of the new covenant was communicated by the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah. He writes this: the time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and Judah. It won't be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt. They broke that covenant with me, even though I was their husband, declares the Lord. Now this is the covenant that I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my instructions where? Within them, and engrave them on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. So even with the presence of the new covenant, even with all of this fine-tuning, Jesus does not discard the Mosaic law. Jesus says this in Matthew chapter 5. I say to you very seriously that as long as heaven and earth exist, neither the smallest letter nor even the smallest stroke of a pen will be erased from the law until everything there becomes a reality. So Jesus makes it clear that the law has served a critical role in redemptive history. Paul makes the same argument in Galatians chapter 3. He says the law has become our tutor to lead us to Christ. So the law communicated the nature of God, the law communicated the character of God, so that humanity would recognize him when he came to dwell among us. The Old Testament law said, this is what God looks like. This is who God is. This is the character of God. This is what he loves. This is what he hates. So when Jesus showed up on the scene, we could go, that's the one. Because that's the one that shows the character of God. New Testament scholar Scott Hafeman says this about the law and the differences between the old and the new covenants. The contrast between the new and Sinai covenants is not a contrast between a covenant with and without an external law, nor is it a contrast between two different kinds of laws. Rather, the contrast between the two covenants is a contrast between the two different conditions of the people who are brought into these covenants and their correspondingly different responses to the same law. And so in other words, the problem with the law, the problem with the old covenant was not the law. The problem was the people, surprisingly enough, right? Thus, the solution of the new covenant is not about changing the law, it's about changing what? the people. It's about changing us. It's about changing our hearts, right? So the law was not bad. The law was not wiped out with the coming of Christ. Rather, it was a partial, time-bound, and culture-bound revelation of the character of God. It served as we read, a tutor to show us who God is and ultimately who Christ is. So in conclusion, we see that the theocracy of Israel is established with the people of God, Abraham's offspring, on their way to the place of God, Canaan, led by the presence of God. So God has now fulfilled his promise to Abraham of all those things. Let me pray for you, and then you can have a good rest of your night. And if you have questions, come on up and let's talk. And if you could help me sort of clean up, that'd be great too. God, you are good, and your mercy endures forever. God, thank you again as we thank you every week for the richness that's found in your scripture that too often we skate on past. But thank you for the ways that you showed yourself to us so that when Jesus came, we could know what you look like and know that that was you walking around in the flesh. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for your desire to dwell with us, to be with us. We don't even like us sometimes, but you love us and you want to be with us. Thank you for loving us that way. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Have a great night, everybody.
I can only get one down.
Don't forget, 10:30 Sunday.
We gotta be here at 9:30.
I gotta be here at 7:45.